All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My colleague Maxime Lefebvre and I are very pleased to welcome you in the webinar series of the ESCP Geopolitics Institute. Today, 5 years after Brexit, we will discuss recent development in the UK-EU relationship. A few days ago, polls show that if the referendum was taking place today, the majority of British will vote to stay in the EU. In the meantime, global geopolitics tensions call for more cooperation between London and Brussels. The tone between the UK and the EU has actually shifted from confrontation to cautious cooperation. Overcoming the tensions of the post-Brexit negotiations, the UK-EU summit, which took place mid-May 2025, aimed at reviving relations between the two parties. While the UK and the EU have signed a security and defense partnership, the shared reluctance for renegotiating the trade and cooperation agreement seems to prevent any profound change in relations. Hence, the question of this webinar: is the UK-EU relationship entering a strategic reset? Is this a genuine reset or just pragmatic diplomacy? In order to better understand the situation and discuss the current relationship between the UK and the EU, we are pleased to welcome two experts. So, Pauline Schnapper. Pauline is Professor of British Politics at Université of Sorbonne, Nouvelle. She specializes in UK international politics with a focus on relationship with the EU. She published several scientific articles and is also very present in the media commenting Brexit. So thank you very much, Pauline, for being with us. And we also welcome Irina van Wiese. Irina is a lawyer, a former member of the European Parliament, where she represented the London regions. She quitted the parliament with the Brexit, actually. She's a liberal Democrat councillor, and last but not least, an affiliate professor of international law of political science at ESCP. So we'll start the discussion with two presentations. We'll start with Pauline, who is going to give us insight on the current EU-UK relationship and the steps that represent the 19th of May summit. And we will follow with further insights on the current trend and the political context in the UK with Irina. Of course, as usual, we'll then take your questions. So do not hesitate to start putting your question below on the Q&A tag, within the Q&A tag. And of course, as usual, my colleague Maxime is going to moderate the debate. So let's now start. Thank you very much. Pauline, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you for the invitation. I'm delighted to be here and to talk to you about UK-EU relations, an endless topic, of course. But the recent developments are extremely interesting, so I'm glad to have this opportunity to talk about it. So the word that is used is that of reset. That's what Keir Starmer wanted to do and said he would do when he became Prime Minister last July. And for sure, there was a need for such a reset because there had been years of tensions between the UK and the EU following the 2016 Brexit referendum. I'm not going to go into details here. We don't really have the time, but I will just remind you that the negotiations between the UK and the EU were extremely complicated, extremely difficult, that Boris Johnson in particular, when he was Prime Minister between 2019 and 2022, proved to be a very difficult partner in those negotiations and finally opted for what was called at the time a hard Brexit. So leaving not just the European Union, but also the single market and the customs union, which had never really been debated during the referendum campaign and was not obvious at all in 2016. So that was really a choice that was made by the then Prime Minister. And tensions followed on a number of issues, including the question of the border between Northern Ireland and the South, the Republic of Ireland, which was going to become the UK-EU border as well, but also other issues like fisheries, a particular issue for France, as we know, but also immigration, another issue that affected the bilateral relation between France and Britain. So For years until 2022, the tensions and the disputes were numerous, and trust between the European Commission and the London government had completely collapsed. What I just want to make sure you understand here is that the gradual improvement in the relationship didn't start with Starmer last July, but actually before that, under Rishi Sunak, things started to improve when Rishi Sunak, so Prime Minister from 22 to 24, negotiated the so-called Windsor framework and found a final, or well, in as much as you can call any agreement around Brexit as final, but some sort of agreement with the European Commission about Northern Ireland. This was really the turning point when the European institutions and the Commission in particular started to take the British government a little bit more seriously, if you want, than under Johnson, and made it possible to think about a real improvement in the relation. But that improvement, and that's another important point, is constrained in any way by the so-called trade and cooperation agreement between Britain and the EU, which set in stone what I've just said about this hard Brexit. This is the framework in which an improvement in the relationship can take place, and that is very constraining. So what's happened in the last few months is nevertheless very important and interesting, at least from a political and symbolic perspective. Starmer made clear as leader of the Labour Party and then as Prime Minister that he would break with this very negative attitude of the previous Conservative governments towards Europe, and that he would restore friendship and cooperation with the European Union. Politically, that was really important. And that led to last month's summit in Brussels on the 19th of May. What do we have there? In many ways, this was a bit of a disappointment in the sense that there are not many tangible outcomes from this summit. The only agreement that was actually reached was over fisheries on France's insistence. The rest is rather a sort of to-do list of things that Britain and the EU want to negotiate in the coming months and possibly even years, because some of those issues are extremely technical and complicated. That includes, and I'll just mention them, and maybe we can come back to them in the discussion. Youth mobility. There's this whole idea pushed by the Europeans, and Germany in particular, to make it possible for young people to live and work in the UK, or for British young people to live and work in Europe for a limited period of time. That's something that the Germans, but also the French, are very keen on, and the British much less so. That's the first area that will be discussed. Another important one from an economic point of view is what we would call the veterinary agreements, or phytosanitary agreement, with the idea that the UK would align with European regulations so that trade between the UK and the EU would be made easier than it has been since Britain actually left the EU. Trade in goods has gone down in the last few years, and reaching an agreement in the future, but that will be very difficult, would make it easier for British goods and European goods to travel between the two areas. There's also a negotiation about the mutual recognition of qualifications, which is on the table. Again, that's pretty technical, but has practical consequences for a lot of people who could work more easily in the UK or the other way around. One big area, considering the present strategic environment, is that of defense. The British government would like to have access to the new so-called SAFE program for procurement in Europe, which would benefit the defense industry in the UK. France is not so keen to have British competitors in the SAFE program, but because of the situation in Europe and Ukraine, there is a big push to improve procurement and to spend more and to build more in that area. So this is really, defense is an area where the UK really has added value for improving European defense. And finally, there's also energy, and in particular, connecting the British electricity grid to continental Europe is one of the things that were discussed last month, but again, more as a sort of long-term goal than immediate result. So it's more a to-do list than really a number of practical achievements, because there is this big limit, which I already referred to, the trade and cooperation agreement, and the fact that Starmer has completely ruled out what would really have a massive impact on the British economy, which would be to rejoin, if not the EU, at least the customs union and possibly the single market. That would really make a big difference. But the Starmer government, for all sorts of reasons, including mostly domestic political reasons, which Irina will come back to, has refused to do. So that really limits the extent of the reset of the between the UK and the EU. These are the so-called red lines that Starmer continues to stick to. Still, and I will finish with this, there has been a dramatic change in the atmosphere, in the political relations between the UK and the European Union as an institution, but also with the member states of the European Union. And that is really a great improvement, which is possibly one of the few good consequences of the wars that we are surrounded with at the moment. At least it has focused the minds of governments across the channel on the need to cooperate more. But in terms of economic effects in particular, at the moment, this reset is still very limited and will probably be quite limited for some time yet. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Pauline, for this very comprehensive and complete view of the EU-UK relation after the summit of the 19th of May. So, Irina, I see you have switched on your camera, so now you can explain to us the motivation of the UK government and the situation of the domestic scene in the UK.
Thank you, Maxime and Pauline, for this very accurate and comprehensive summary. I will not repeat any of this. I will speak, if you permit me, in my function as a UK politician. I should say I was a member of the European Parliament only as part of the last of the UK cohort from July 2019 to the Brexit day, 31st of January 2020. So I was part of the withdrawal negotiations, withdrawal agreement negotiations with the UK, which was painful for me as somebody who fought very hard to stay in the EU and against Brexit. So what we are seeing, what we have been seeing since Brexit, I think is a shift, but not a complete pivoting. Two things that happened post-Brexit, I think, focused people's minds. The first one was, of course, the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And that has undoubtedly driven the UK back closer, particularly in the area of defense and security, as Pauline already mentioned, because cooperation there is simply indispensable for both parties. The second thing that happened, I think, was Trump's election last year, and the fact that the UK is no longer sure that it can rely so much on its special relationship with our friends across the channel, across the Atlantic rather than the channel. I will come back to that in a moment when I will comment on the so-called reset agreement. So, of course, what happened as well in the UK, and I think we are not so different in that respect from France and indeed Germany and most of the rest of continental Europe, is that we are seeing an increasing polarization of our society, which in some way was preceded by the very acrimonious Brexit debate. We mustn't forget that already in 2016, when we had the Brexit referendum, there were families that were split over this issue and stopped talking to each other at the dinner table. It was a very, very painful process. And of course, the narrow margin by which the Brexit party and the Brexit Leave campaign won, 52 to 48% of the population, indicates that, you know, it has left at least 40% of the British population rather aggrieved. Now, I think Pauline mentioned that when we're looking at today's surveys and polls on that issue, you will find a significant majority of people who regret Brexit. Now, that is not the same as the question of would you like to have another referendum and potentially rejoin the European Union? If you ask the latter question, you'll have a much, much lower percentage of people who say yes, because they simply don't want to open these old wounds that were created by the Brexit debate. They had enough of the topic. That is not to say that another referendum, if held tomorrow, would not yield a different result and that people wouldn't now say they want to stay. That majority pivots between over 50 to in the mid 60% of people. So we do have a large amount of people who regret Brexit. It is also clear that if you discount the devastating effects of both the pandemic and the Ukraine war on the UK economy, you are left with about 4% of GDP damage, net effect of just Brexit. 4% of GDP, which we lost as a country, simply because we left the European Union. And that has left Britain, of course, in an extremely weak economic position. Now, you would ask, why on earth does Keir Starmer not use his quite sizable majority that he obtained in the national elections last year in order to go beyond what is now called the reset, and which Pauline described, which are quite, as she rightly said, quite tentative steps in a rapprochement with the EU. Why does Keir Starmer not turn away from the disastrous policy of the previous government in terms of EU-UK relations? Because you would think that a first step in a rapprochement is to rebuild trust, which was, of course, very badly damaged in the wake of the withdrawal negotiations, and indeed in the way that the UK government sometimes broke their own promises to the EU. So I think there are a number of reasons, and I should say I don't speak for the government. I'm in an opposition party. I would not dare to assume what exactly is going on in our Prime Minister's mind. But I think there are two things. And the first one is the obvious one, and that is the Reform Party. The Reform Party is the successor party of the Brexit Party, which before then was called United Kingdom Independence Party and was instrumental in driving the Brexit referendum. And of course, still led by Nigel Farage, the same person, who has now rebuilt his party as a, say, more traditional right extreme populist party, which is not so dissimilar from the likes of Rassemblement in France or the AfD in Germany, or indeed other assorted populist right-wing parties across Europe. Now, Reform is now polling in the latest polls as the strongest party in the UK. So if we had a national election tomorrow under our majority electoral system, Reform would win not an absolute, but a relative majority. And that means that the other parties would be forced into some form of coalition if they wanted to stave off that threat. That combined with the shift of the Conservative Party to the right, although the Conservative Party is now so much weakened that it is questionable if they would indeed come as a second or third or indeed fourth party at a new election. But this shift to the right has in many ways tied Keir Starmer's hands, particularly when he's looking at his rather Eurosceptic union base. So the people who are in the trade unions who have always been skeptical towards the European Union. And he needs these people. And he needs to fight the onslaught from Reform in many of his constituencies. So his reset really is something that is tentative. One pertinent example is that the youth mobility scheme is now called something entirely different. I think youth flexibility or something ridiculous like that, because apparently
youth experience.
The youth experience, thank you, Pauline. So the youth experience team, because apparently the term mobility could be confused with free movement, which of course was one of the red lines for the UK government and one of the reasons why arguably the Brexit referendum won. So no free movement, but just a very, very limited youth mobility scheme, as Pauline mentioned, was agreed. And the other thing that I found extraordinary was the day after the 19th of May, when the agreement was reached, fisheries was all over the news and an apparent surrender of sovereignty of the UK, because fishery rights for EU fishermen in UK waters were extended for an indefinite period of time, and that was seen as a surrender by right-wing parties in the UK. Very little mention was made of the significant Defence and Security Pact, which, as Pauline mentioned, may grant UK companies access to EU defence market and may, if it is agreed, be worth, I read, up to 150 billion euros for the, 150 billion euro defence fund, which may be worth quite a lot to the UK economy. The other thing that I will very briefly mention is the UK's very ambivalent relationship with the United States post-Trump election. And of course, Trump is very keen to divide and rule. He's been treating the UK apparently more favorable than the EU, as far as we can judge this today. Obviously, with Trump, we never know. He may change his mind tomorrow. He has granted the UK provisionally 10% instead of 25% tariffs, which is still quite a lot, on assorted goods. He is now negotiating with regard to food and cars, so that there could be potentially a free trade agreement. What he overlooks is the fact that steel, of course, is much more important for the UK economy, and we still do not have an agreement with the United States on steel exports. So that may still go up to 25 or even to 50%. We don't know yet. But the truth is that in light of this uncertainty, of course, an agreement with the EU on steel and food, which has been negotiated already, that could add £9 billion to the UK economy by 2040. And that is in stark contrast to the very sort of untangible potential trade deal with the US. So what we're seeing, I think, is a shift away from the US and towards the EU. It is tentative, and it is mainly driven by internal pressures from the far-right Reform Party at the moment. I think if as Pauline rightly said, if the UK government, which is struggling to keep public support, actually Keir Starmer is polling very badly at the moment, they will have to get the UK economy back on track. And most people agree, even those who are not very Europhile, that the only way to do that indeed is to work towards some form of customs union with the EU in the medium or in the long term. I leave it at that because I'm really looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Irina. So thank you, both of you. The chat is open, so please give your questions on the chat. I see already a question of Yves Doutrio, who was a former ambassador. He's teaching in ESCP. And he's asking if the veterinary agreement on the to-do list of the EU-UK relationship can be compared with the free trade agreement between UK and USA. I suppose no, it's something different, but maybe you can, both of you, explain more about the relation of the UK and Keir Starmer in particular between Trump and the EU. Is there a kind of choice or double negotiation or double relation? How do you see this diplomatic game of the UK between the US, the traditional special relationship, and the European Union? Maybe Pauline first?
Yes, okay. I'm glad to answer this question because it's a good opportunity to clarify things. The agreement that normally, because you never know with Trump, the UK and the US have signed or are about to sign is not a free trade deal. And that needs to be really, really clear. A free trade deal is what the British government dreams of getting from the US and has dreamt of getting for the last 10 years. But that's not what they got a few months ago. It's a very limited deal which reduces the tariffs that Trump wants to impose on the European Union and gives a sort of special treatment to the UK, which will suffer from less high tariffs, but it's nothing like a free trade deal. And in particular, that's the reason for that is that the British government, whether Starmer or actually even probably its predecessors, are not prepared to accept the sort of conditions that the American governments would want to impose to get such a free trade deal, which is things like accepting, the much laxer regulations that the Americans have on agricultural products, chemicals, genetically modified products, etc. The British consumers are not ready to accept that. And as a result, it's very unlikely. I don't usually talk about the future, but I would bet that there will be no free trade deal between the UK and the US in the near future. And what is interesting is that Starmer has been very careful not to close any door vis-à-vis the European Union when signing this deal with the US. He made sure precisely that a vet agreement and an SPS, sanitary and phytosanitary agreement would still be possible with the EU, because he's well aware that much more trade is being done with the EU than with the US. So actually, he has navigated that issue relatively well between the EU and the US, managing to please Trump and to flatter Trump, as they all try to do, but he has done it relatively more successfully than other European leaders, while keeping all his options open with the EU, especially from an economic point of view. And more generally, I don't want to speak for too long, I'll just finish with that, but more generally, that's really what he has tried to do in strategic terms as well between Europe and the US. He has said from the start that Britain shouldn't have to choose between the US and the EU, which is a very classically British perspective on foreign policy, to try to have your cake and eat it, and to both have a special relationship with the US and, if possible, a good relationship with the EU as well. That's what he wants to do. Whether it is possible in the long term and with Trump in power is difficult to say. Where he has a good point is in saying that we Europeans need the US for our defense and security, and that we can't just close our door on because we don't like Trump. So he's trying to navigate that as well. Again, I'm not sure it will be successful in the long run, but you can see where he's trying to go, I would say. And that's, but maybe Irina has a different perspective.
No, not at all. I totally agree. I think it's very interesting. Of course, Starmer is not the only politician who's trying to walk that balancing act between Trump and the rest of the world at the moment. But it is true that Starmer is looking over his shoulder. And although there is a right-wing populist party, it is not necessarily pro-Trump. Actually, a large majority of UK citizens expressed their displeasure of Trump in different forms. So I think, for example, the idea of the famous chlorinated chicken being imported from the US, which has become kind of a myth here in the UK, and whether or not it is actually damaging to health, we don't know. I certainly don't know, but it has become a big no-no, as Pauline rightly said. So agriculture is a big deal. I think that the EU would under no circumstances accept any kind of products that do not comply with EU regulation to be entering the market via Northern Ireland or any other way. So indeed, it is true that Trump has in many ways forced Starmer to cooperate more closely with the EU. And I think we will see that continuing. And if it bears fruit, as in if it actually improves growth and the cost of living crisis that at the moment is hurting the Labour government in the UK, then hopefully it will continue in that direction.
Thank you very much. It's very clear. So we see that the UK is still trying to focus on its relation with the EU and not jumping into a free trade agreement with the USA. There is another question in the chat, so there are already many questions, so it's very good. And of course, if we turn eastwards, it's a question of the relation with Russia. How do you see, both of you, the relationship of the UK with Russia, and the balancing also between Russia and the USA, and of course with the Ukraine war, given the new policy of Trump, the new orientation of Trump, trying to improve the relationship with Putin? Irina, Pauline, first.
I'm happy to start, although I'm not an expert on Russia, but I think what we have seen is that the UK, interestingly, both the Conservative government and the relatively new Labour government that has been in power for a year now, have been quite hawkish on Russia. So actually from the start, the UK has pressed for sanctions as well as closer security and defence cooperation, mostly within NATO, and has pushed to the degree possible the United States to do more in terms of supporting Ukraine in their defense. And as I said earlier, I think this is one of the drivers between a rapprochement between the UK and the EU. And of course, we also have the so-called Weimar Plus agreement, which was beyond the EU, which of course included the EU Commission. But also beyond that, I think it was France, Germany, Poland, Italy, Spain, the UK, and the European Commission who were talking about fostering defense, geopolitical coordination, and unity specifically with regard to Ukraine. So the UK plays an important role here. And I think Starmer is, in that case, is actually continuing the previous policy of the Conservative government. Pauline, I don't know if you have other insights.
No, absolutely. Talking about relationship between the UK and Russia, there's no relationship between the UK and Russia at the moment. The UK is completely aligned with the European vision at the moment, not with that of Trump. And we saw that a few months ago when Starmer and Macron tried to set up this coalition of the willing with the idea that if a ceasefire was reached in Ukraine, they might send troops to keep this ceasefire. Now, there's not real talk about this anymore, but it was interesting to see that on this issue, on the Ukraine war, there's absolutely no difference between the UK and the rest of the European Union, or at least the big countries. The format that the UK pursues is more NATO, sort of European pillar within NATO. If Trump and the Americans are not going to be reliable partners anymore, the UK would want the European members of NATO to step up in cooperation with the non-European NATO members like Canada or Norway or Turkey. So that's the sort of format, minilateral, multilateral coalition of the willing. That's something that the UK would be more comfortable with probably than the European Union, if only because it's no longer a member. But otherwise, that's really a tiny, it's not even a difference. It's more difference about tactics, but certainly not about Russia and Ukraine.
Maybe a follow-up question on this. Traditionally, the UK was not very enthusiastic about European defense policy and about, Europe becoming more independent from NATO. What we have seen from the last NATO summit, it was last week. Do you see that as a good convergence between European countries, the UK and the partners of the UK, in addressing the relationship with Trump, trying to preserve the transatlantic relationship, but at the same time possibly developing more responsibility for the Europeans, including through a new partnership in defense that you mentioned, Pauline, earlier. Do you see there is a convergence between European countries on that, or do you see still some differences between the countries?
Is it for me, this question, or for Ilian?
Both of you. maybe Pauline first.
Go ahead, Pauline.
Well, I'd say it's hard to draw any conclusion from that NATO summit because it wasn't really a NATO summit. I mean, it was a 2-hour meeting where all the other member states tried to appease Trump. I mean, it was a bit pathetic, but it was also a sign that the Europeans in general desperately need the Americans at least for a number of years for their security. So I don't know. I think it's a bit difficult to draw any sort of conclusion. But again, from a British perspective, I think there isn't really any difference on NATO anymore, in the sense that everybody more or less agrees now that the EU doesn't really have a defense yet, and therefore that the NATO resources will be necessary for years to come. So in practical terms, I don't see much difference between the UK perspective and that of the other non-US NATO members.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, if you permit me to speak as a politician, not on behalf of my party, but on my own accord, I think that there is probably now more alignment between those, certainly the coalition of the willing, which includes the UK, on defense spending than there is between a number of EU member states. So we can clearly see that the move towards the 5% threshold, 5% GDP contribution to defense, which is a huge, huge step up for most states, maybe apart from Poland, who had no other choice, arguably. That is a step that has been driven, of course, by Trump, maybe for ulterior motivation, but certainly something that has brought, again, the UK closer to some of the EU member states, whereas others, of course, notably Hungary, Slovakia, and others are not that happy because they do not see Russia so much as a threat, or maybe not at all, maybe as an ally. So again, I think maybe we see that the UK on defense and security will prove itself to be a more reliable ally than it has been on other topics.
Maybe another question on the diplomatic side. It's a question of Yves Dutriot again about the role of the E3. You know that the E3 it's a format between France, Germany, and the UK on the negotiations on Iran, which had started in 2003. And even after the Brexit, this format has continued to play a role in the negotiation in Iran. There was a meeting of the E3 with Iran just before the strikes of the US against Iran. Do you see this format develop in foreign policy issues, play a role, you know, in a kind of European convergence on other topics? Maybe you mentioned, Irina, the Weimar Plus with Ukraine, but maybe on the Middle East. Do you see the kind of possible new formats with the UK and some EU members on diplomatic issues to achieve a better cooperation and a better maybe better action on the diplomatic side?
Well, I certainly hope so. And I should say I'm not an expert on Middle East or Iran at all, but I do hope that in general, this kind of pragmatic cooperation between Germany, France, and the UK has been obviously incredibly important, both even when the UK was a member. As a matter of fact, I remember very well the degree to which even in my political group in Renew Europe, the UK very often played the go-between between France and Germany. And because of this sort of more pragmatic approach, but also I think because of the UK's diplomatic relations for historical and other reasons with a large number of third countries across the globe is extremely important. So I am encouraged by the fact that the UK is still involved on the global stage in geopolitical negotiations, that France and Germany are still partners in those trilateral negotiations with third countries. It's extremely important. This is not an EU issue, of course. It is to the degree that there is some foreign policy, but those three countries, as the largest in terms of economics, at least the largest EU member states and largest European states, I think the cooperation on defense and security and more generally on foreign policy is indispensable. And the three together in agreement, of course, could also possibly be a counterweight to President Trump's attempt to divide and rule, and particularly to pick the UK off from the rest of Europe?
Pauline, do you also see a possible a potential of convergence, better convergence between the UK and big member states such as France and Germany in the EU3, for example?
Well, first, I want to apologize. I had a Wi-Fi problem and disappeared for a few minutes, but the connection seems to have come back. Sorry about this. The E3, yeah, well, the E3 worked mostly, at least for a while, towards Iran. It's really the only instance so far where there's been a, well, successful. Considering what happened in the last few days, it's hard to talk about a success for the E3 lately. But at first, 10 years ago, it worked relatively well. As Irina was saying earlier, I think it's likely to be more something like Weimar Plus than really the E3, because nowadays talking simply about France, Germany, and the UK in Europe doesn't really have much sense. I mean, not having Poland on the one hand wouldn't really make sense. Italy and Spain to a lesser extent, because we've seen how both Italy and Spain are very reluctant to make any sort of commitment towards more European defense. But certainly Poland but also smaller member states are very important now. The Baltic states, Scandinavian countries, in the context of the Ukraine war, are in many ways more important to France and the UK than Spain or Italy at the moment. So I would see this more developing possibly than a sort of consortium of big countries.
Thank you very much. I jump to another question of the chat about the question of immigration. How do you see the development of immigration? The question says that there is an increase of non-EU immigration in the UK. Do you confirm that? And how do you see the subject of immigration in the UK? How it relates to the relation between the EU and UK?
Where would you like to start, Maxime?
As you want. Maybe Pauline? Oh, right. Well, the shifts in immigration pattern is one of the big paradoxes of Brexit, because as stated in the question in the chat, indeed, reducing immigration was the main factors for many voters who chose to leave the EU. They wanted fewer immigrants, and especially fewer European immigrants. That's what happened, in the sense that with the end of free circulation, you have had indeed a decrease in the number of large decrease, quite dramatic decrease in the number of European immigrants coming to the UK, and also Europeans leaving the UK because feeling that they were no longer wanted in Britain. But that has been compensated, and actually more than compensated, by an influx of non-EU immigrants with absolutely legal visas, because all the jobs that the European immigrants filled or were going to fill, well, had to be filled by others. So the British government increased the number of visas for countries like Nigeria, India, etc. And the balance between immigration and emigration, and between European and non-European, has actually been very positive. So you have many more immigrants coming in the last few years, a little bit less so in the last year, because there have been changes in visas for family reunion. But broadly, since 2021, you've had an increase in overall immigration and not a reduction. That's one of the ironies of Brexit. So the question was absolutely to the point.
If I may add to that, I think we need to distinguish, as Pauline rightly did, between legal and illegal migration numbers. So firstly, absolutely, it is true that overall migration numbers fell. I think net migration fell slightly in 2024. I've just had a quick look at the numbers. But it is still above historical norms, and as you rightly said, it is heavily driven by legal migration from non-EU countries. EU net migration is now negative at minus 96,000 people, while non-EU immigration remains robust. So that's on the legal side, and of course, what we saw after Brexit was an exodus of EU staff, mainly from our care professions, hospitals, etc., which was potentially disastrous for the EU, the already embedded UK health system. As far as illegal migration is concerned, the numbers are up. Leaving the EU has made the problem worse because there is now no longer a Dublin system kind of exchange. There is now a pilot program between France and the UK, one in, one out kind of exchange of migrants, which, of course, the Southern European members are very unhappy about. So I'm not sure whether that deal is going to actually enter into force. And I think today there was a new attempt on bilateral negotiations between the UK and France on enforcement mechanisms, because we see that months on months, the numbers of so-called small boats crossing the channel from Calais to Dover is increasing, very sadly, often with fatal consequences for the people on board. So that is a big domestic issue, as it is, of course, in France and other countries. And the Labour government has sought a hard line, quite astonishing hard line, again, possibly pushed by the far right in the UK, which is now very akin to the previous kind of policy taken by the Conservative government.
Thank you very much, Irina, and thank you for having addressed the issue of the Franco-British agreement. There was also a question of Yves du Trio on this issue.
Yeah, it's attempted. It's not an agreement yet. It's a discussion, and we will see whether it is agreed at the next. There's a state visit by President Macron in London in a week from now, and so with a bilateral summit. And we will see whether the agreement is found or not then.
Okay, thank you very much. Also, a question which was asked in the chat is about the future of the relation between the EU and the UK. So you addressed that, Pauline, in saying that it was very difficult even for Starmer to join the customs union or to join the single market. But do you think there are some possibilities of evolution, for example, the free movement of people, or do you think the constraints of this agreement of 2020, the trade and cooperation agreement, will remain and will block any further evolution of the relation?
Well, in theory, you can be a member of the single market without being a member of the European Union. It's the case for Norway, and the case of Switzerland is not exactly, I mean, looks a bit like that, even though it's not exactly that. So in theory, you can, but this is something that none of the British government since the Brexit referendum has contemplated, because the argument was, and it's an argument that you can perfectly understand, that if you're in the single market but not in the EU, you have to follow the rules of the single market without having a say in those rules. You don't sit at the table where the decisions are taken, but you have to implement the rules and the decisions that are taken. And that's the case. That's really what happens with Norway. In the old days, it was called the fax diplomacy, whereby Norway would receive faxes from Brussels telling them what kind of regulations they needed to implement. So that's not something that the British government at the moment, and even less the previous British governments, were ready to do. But in purely economic terms, it would really make a lot of sense. I mean, it was crazy to leave the single market. And it hadn't been discussed during the referendum campaign. So you could have made the case, I don't know what Irina thinks about that as a Lib Dem, but you could have made the case that since it was not discussed in the referendum was about leaving the EU, but it wasn't about leaving the single market. But the other problem with the single market, apart from being rule taker rather than rule maker, is that you have to accept the free circulation, not just of goods, capital, and services, but also of people. And that takes us back to the previous issue.
Trust me, we did raise that point. We still do, Pauline, on every possible occasion in the two houses of parliament. No, I think, I mean, there is a wishful scenario, which I'm happy to outline. And then there is maybe a more realistic scenario. The wishful scenario is that the government, by pure necessity, will have to start doing something to save the economy, that Trump will not come to the rescue, and therefore, which is very unlikely in any case. And therefore, the pragmatic approach that Starmer has taken will continue, particularly with youth experience, not mobility, experience, hopefully extended to 4 years for 18 to 30-year-olds, Erasmus Plus, all these mutually beneficial agreements that also help to rebuild trust, because that, of course, is extremely important on the external front. Domestically, I think the road towards rapprochement, eventually rejoining, is a long one. It needs to be paved. I think we are on the right way, but the society is still extremely divided. And of course, at a time of a cost of living crisis, it is very difficult to look at a very long-term kind of policy. So I think that will take time, but it is simply a necessity economically, but also from a geopolitical perspective, that this rapprochement happens and that it will eventually end in rejoining, because, as Pauline rightly said, a halfway house, particularly when it includes the single market, is not going to be helping the UK very much, neither politically nor economically. The realistic scenario is that at the moment the power that Labour has gained in the elections is threatened. It needs to be reconsolidated. There are a lot of internal rifts, and the threat of the Reform Party is such that it distracts from a lot of other policies. I think it is very real, and this is the first concern of Starmer, probably rightly so, and he will have to do everything to consolidate his power and to hopefully win the next elections again, or at least have some form of coalition against the Reform Party before he can do anything in international terms.
When are the elections, Irina?
In 4 years' time, pretty much exactly, if we have the fixed term of 5 years. But as you know, under the so-called Fixed Parliament Act, the UK government can call early elections whenever they want. At the moment, I don't think they would want to, because it wouldn't look very good for them.
Yes, there is, I would say, a kind of testimony in the chat of someone, probably a student who was looking for a job in the UK, and the postgraduate visa was reduced from 2 years to 18 months, and it was very difficult to find jobs. So I know it's a difficulty also for a university, a school like ESCP, which has a campus and many non-UK students in London trying to find jobs in the UK. So I don't know if the the youth exchange that you mentioned will be a solution for this kind of difficulties. If you see a more rosy future for our students, for the young people, in the framework of the present relationship.
I think there's an important point to bear in mind to understand this sort of strange or stupid policy by the British government, which is to actually reduce the number of student visas at a time when British universities are all in the red and would need actually more students rather than less. Understanding this contradiction requires to bear in mind that in the UK, student numbers are counted in the immigration figures. In other words, if you have Reform UK behind your back and you're desperate to reduce immigration levels to appease your electorate, you reduce the number of student visas. That's a very easy, stupid in the long term, but easy way of reducing immigration. I'm afraid it's nothing more than that.
Well, exactly. And if I may add, I'm really sorry to hear about the problems that our students have. And in my practice as an affiliate professor here in London, I unfortunately hear these stories from my own students again and again, and it makes me very sad. In principle, the youth experience scheme, if it is agreed, and I should say that there was some form of declaration in principle on the 19th of May this year, that they would work towards a balanced youth experience scheme. So we don't know. The council has since approved formal talks, and they're hopeful. And this would target 18 to 30-year-olds. From both the UK and all 27 EU member states. The duration, well, the EU is pressing for 4 years. The UK would like to have 2 years, so that remains to be seen. And that would permit young people to live, work, study, volunteer, or travel in each other's territories. Now, there have been concerns that this would be more expensive for the UK because you would have more incoming than outgoing flow, but we don't really know that. It should also be said that the UK would likely propose a cap, 70 to 80,000 places per year. And again, that's not a lot of people, and participants will still require a dedicated visa. They will have no access to welfare. No dependents are permitted to come with them. And they would have some form of immigration health surcharge, so no free treatment on the NHS. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's limited. And as I said, we don't know yet if and when it will come into force.
Thank you very much. I think it was a very extensive analysis of what the present relation is on immigration, on youth exchange. There was also in the chat a question about the question of supply chains. How do you see companies using the UK in the supply chains, for example, in the relation also with the US? Do you have any recommendations or any analysis for the companies regarding their supply chains and the role of the UK in them?
I mean, I will let Pauline fill in because she's the expert. I just on this topic, as Pauline very rightly said, we don't have a free trade agreement with the US. We do have a free trade agreement with the EU, which is the famous Trade and Cooperation Agreement, although it's not complete and there are some sectors missing from it. It does exist. So in theory, of course, there should be a rerouting if the supply chains with the US are severely disrupted in the future. So it's quite obvious that you would then reroute via the EU. But I will let Pauline talk about the technicalities, which I don't know.
No, I'm really not an expert on these issues at all, and I'm not an economist. All I would say is that everything was disrupted by Brexit, obviously, and the complex sort of supply chains that you have in Europe with parts of goods traveling from one bit to another, then coming back and being, and then again, were really disrupted. And I think that in particular the car industry in the UK was really affected. That is difficult to fix in the sense that, once again, the trade and cooperation agreement is a free trade agreement, as Irina just said, but there are still all those checks at the border. Even if all these spare parts can travel freely, there still needs to be checks, which you didn't have before Brexit. So I don't really see how you can get around that issue for as long as once again the UK is out of the single market. It's really membership of the single market which enables these supply chains to work completely in a fluid way, as far as I know. But again, I'm really not an expert.
Okay, thank you very much. I think that we have already all the questions of the chat answered, so I don't see any other elements. I think we addressed during this webinar many issues, many questions on the EU-UK relationship, the domestic policy in the UK, the youth exchange, the diplomatic games with Ukraine, NATO. Do you see, Vanessa, do you have any question or issue that you would like to raise?
Not particularly. As you said, you know, we went over broad series of questions and answers, very clear, actually, very insightful. So no, nothing to add on my side.
So maybe Rina and Pauline, a word of conclusion for our audience.
Well, I should say that we very much look forward to welcoming President Macron next week in London. Maybe one of you should warn him, because I'm being told that there will be a reception in the Houses of Parliament in front of a massive painting of the Battle of Waterloo, just so that he doesn't have a shock when he arrives. But other than that, he is, of course, very welcome, and we're looking forward to continuing the good relationship. And of course, we're looking forward to hopefully some more concrete outcomes after that visit.
Waterloo is always a polemical question between between French and British. Pauline?
Well, maybe as a conclusion, I would say that those who thought that Brexit would be a simple event taking place after referendum in 2016 and then over were proved very, very wrong. Brexit is definitely a process, and probably never-ending process. And if the British were hoping not to hear about the European Union anymore, they're going to be disappointed, because that's only the start. But the positive thing is that after years of deconstructing, and we have started a process of rebuilding. I would argue it was really a waste of time, energy, and money on both sides of the channel, but at least we are starting to rebuild a relationship, and that is definitely good news, both for the EU and for the UK, I think.
Thank you very much, Pauline and Irina, for this positive note. And thank you, Vanessa. Thank you, Aurélie, who helped us to organize this webinar. It was very interesting, very important. And we are organizing the next webinar probably for the 9th of September. It will be about geopolitics of medicines, la géopolitique des médicaments. Which is, of course, an important economic sector. Thank you all. Thank you. Have a good evening, everybody, and thank you for your attention and your participation.
Thank you very much, all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.